What a pleasure, I have to say. Here I am again with Michael Smith, uh, my mentor, my inspiration at many different points in my life. And here we are for a second chat, hoping to pick up on some of the ideas we didn't get to last time. How are you today?
I'm good. Beautiful day.
Yeah, sure
Yeah,
is.
yeah. Weird.
Yeah,
Nice.
I'm going to possibly slow us down a little bit at the start, just to share one or two slides. So when I woke up before our last talk, which was maybe 2 years ago, I woke up that morning and I listed a humongous list of ideas, concepts, phrases that I remembered from my time working with and then training under you. And we didn't get to all of them at all, but we did get to quite a bit. And I think this is a pretty representative list of the things we talked about last time. And I will encourage anybody who's watching this to check out that first round. But today I have a couple new topics that I think would probably work pretty well. These are leftovers from the last list. I think the ones at the top might work uh, as like maybe a talking point after we just talk about briefly your new book that's coming out soon. So if you don't mind, would you tell us just a little bit about the background of this book, and maybe we can get into some of these concepts.
Sure. Well, Jeff and Hugh and Deborah and I were all had sort of a different tipping point for us about how we recognized that we needed to do more than complain about the proliferation of fake news or information pollution or new propaganda, well, however you want to phrase it, and do something to to address it. And the start of the book was it's kind of an easy thing to say we need to do more than, um, but I think that it doesn't recognize. I mean, you're a teacher, you know, you're already doing enough, right? And so the idea of adding this, I mean, many of the people who advocate for this advocate for major curricular sort of interventions that address this issue. But we found a couple of things. One is that, or we started with a belief in a couple of things. One is that teachers are already so busy,
Mhm.
and so telling them you need to do this new thing, people were not going to do it unless they could be linking it to something that they already did in some meaningful kind of way. And then secondly, that the idea of critical reading or critical writing, less critical reading, is different across different kinds of reading. It's similar, but different because the texts that promulgate information pollution are different kind of texts that work similarly, but in different kind of ways. So that was sort of the genesis of the project. And then each of us working with kids who I don't know who manifested a need for this kind of instruction. So my little story was working with in a college access program, working with a student who was persuaded by a for-profit college that that's the college he should apply to, not being sort of persuaded to do so by the the materials, the publication material, the publicity materials that he had been sent by that school. It was one of those schools where their students came out with debt primarily. And so when you're working with a kid who's first generation, it's going to be the first student to go to college, to send him for him to go to one of those schools
Yeah.
seemed seemed crazy. Now that seems like a little story in some kind of ways. We also had students. I also had one student who you name the conspiracy, and he was into it. And so that idea is as well. So each of us had a sort of a tipping point that said we need to start attending to this
Yeah.
a bit more than we currently do. So that was sort of the genesis of the project.
Awesome. I think we've
Oh,
all been
let me
there
say
in
one.
one form
Let
or
me say
another.
what. Let me say one other thing is that the other issue that we um, that we thought was true is that most of the programs with which we're familiar, most of the interventions with we're familiar, focus on what fake news is and how it works, not what in an individual what makes me susceptible to falling victim to fake news or information. So we wanted to write something that would address those issues as well, not just what it is and what you need to do is, but looking inwards and to find out your areas of susceptibility and how you might want to address those.
Yeah, that's a personal interest of mine. That's good to hear. Yeah, because I didn't know anything about the book until you just started telling me now. So we'll probably not talk mainly about the book today, but by all means infuse it in as we move forward.
Okay.
If you don't mind, just to stay on the fake news topic just a bit longer. I just want to tell you a couple of, I guess, maybe where I am at as far as my understanding of the concept, which is pretty minimal. And then, I don't know, maybe that could fuel something moving forward. You could correct me, of course. I believe it came into popularity, that term, right around 2015, 16 or so, pre that election. I believe it's used often, I guess, on different sides of, like, mostly in the political sphere, but not always, but it often gets politicized. And the term is used often by people on different sides, but they might not have the same exact context for how they're using it. But it is, it is used as a weapon, as a slur, and often as an accurate statement. I think like, say, like the people who from the start thought that, like, Trump was going to be attacked no matter what. Like, that was, like, the plan was to, like, get rid of the guy by any means necessary. Or the people who thought, like, that this was, like, the worst threat to the country. I don't believe either of those people had much reason to abandon, like, their points of view since that time to now, largely because of, like, this fake news concept. So does that sound like somewhat accurate?
I mean, I think that there are different positions about what it is. So on the one hand, it might mean, I mean, there's a range. On one hand, it might mean news I don't like.
Yeah.
A little bit less, it might be news that I find biased in some fashion or another. News that's consistent with somebody's predisposition to believe a certain way. I mean, but those are different from the sort of deep fake videos that are, digital texts that are deliberately created to deceive. So I mean, so one of the things there's this range, and when people talk about disinformation, malinformation, so there's a different range of things.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be alert to all of them to the extent that we can, and help our students come to understand these differences. And I mean, and that's one of the differences, one of the things that was that we're thinking about is the issue of transfer, about applying skills and strategies that you have in one domain to another. And so one might think that that if you're reading an ironic text, an ironic literary text, that would transfer, or that would be those skills, those critical reading skills, would be able to be immediately applicable to this new arena. One of the differences that we say is that in a literary text, the most meaningful reading happens when you recognize that you're meant to recognize that the source of information is flawed. We're meant to recognize that Hawk Finn is a flawed source of information, or the famous first-person narrators. In the digital domain, we're often meant not to. I mean, they're deliberately deceptive as opposed to being on surface deceptive, if you will. So we need to do a different kind of work then, that we can't count on things happening sort of automatically, if you will. And I know in my own teaching, I'm probably too sanguine about how readily transfer happens, even though my whole story is, um, that I went back to get my PhD because I was worried about just that issue. I mean, when I was a high school teacher, I was reasonably confident, maybe shouldn't have been, but I was confident that when I was teaching my students to write, when we were working on a paper, an argument or a narrative paper, for example, that I was teaching them to write more than the particular paper on which they were working.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
When I was teaching literature, I was not confident at all that I was doing more than help them understand the particular book that we were working on. And so that became an unsustainable thing for me. So I went back to study to try to think about how I could design instruction that would make it more likely that what students were learning in one sort of textual encounter they would transfer and they would be able to apply to the next one. So anyway, so that issue of transfer has been something, and I know that that's sort of an old-fashioned term, but it's still the one that I use, is that the application or the appropriation. Peter Smagorinsky wants to say the appropriation of something that you learn in one sort of circumstance and applying it to another. So anyway.
Yeah, and I remember either you or Jeff Wilhelm would use phrases like certain heuristics that you could move around, or portable problem-solving sets.
Yeah.
Are these terms that still work as far as how you think about transfer, be it high, like kind of high road or low road transfer?
Well, yeah, I mean, the difference between high road, this is from a David Perkins paper, and Gabrielle Solomon, who wrote about, I mean, low road transfer is transfer where situations are sufficiently similar that the transfer happens automatically. And I think the example that they give is if you're given text, you in some ways you start to read it. The example that I give when I'm talking about it in class is that I drive a Mini Countryman. If you toss me the keys to your Mini Cooper and it was the same year, I could just hop in the car and drive it. If you toss me the keys to a bus, I couldn't. I would have to step back. I would have to have a conscious control of what I was going to do. And so the mindful awareness of an approach that you're taking to a problem-solving behavior, the further you move something, that you need to move something, that the more dissimilar the contexts are, the more conscious awareness you have of what you're transferring. That's why same thing would happen in teaching. If I'm teaching into very similar, like your I don't know, your second period class, you probably transfer what you learned from your second period to your third period without thinking too much about it. But if you were saying, what am I doing with my sixth graders? And say that you're going to do professional development for your colleagues.
Yeah.
You might say, okay, what you would have to say something like, are the principles that I believe obtain, are there understandings that I believe that obtain across its educational context, so that I can apply what I've learned in one context to this new context. So, so that seems to me, and if you believe that that teaching should be future oriented, that's the question that you have to ask yourself. What are we doing today that's going to help them do something new or different tomorrow? And as I said, I'm afraid that too often we think stuff is going to happen automatically when it doesn't.
Yes. I have like 5 questions now. One of them was, you went back to school to be more conscious about developing this type of transfer.
Yeah.
And did you find out that, did you get good at it, would you say? And to what extent does that fuel like what you do? Generally, does it fuel your work?
Well,
and what did you find out?
So initially when I started to think about, the focus was teaching literature. So what I tried to understand is how to experience readers read and talk about texts, so that if I could name those things, then I might be able to teach them. So, for example, I did work in my dissertation was about reading. It's called Giving Short People Reading and Teaching Irony and Poetry, Giving Short People a Reason to Live. And it's built around the idea of different cues that Wayne Booth has identified in a rhetoric of irony that experienced readers use to understand that we should be suspicious. I mean, they're just easy. We have, as experienced readers, we have hot buttons that we use to make a judgment about whether a narrator, how much to trust the narrator, right? If the narrator is too young, we're at least a little bit suspicious. If the narrator is too self-interested, we're a little bit suspicious. The narrator's immoral, we're suspicious. All of those things. But if I can name those things, then I can create experiences to help my students understand them as well. So this would be, and so what I was trying to do is trying to think about that, and then think about the way that people use and talk about literature. Let me give you one example. I think that I did a study of adult book clubs, where one of the things that was interesting to me is that the conversation in adult book clubs, for the most part, did not move on the basis of questions. It moved on the basis of statements. So, I mean, that's sort of a challenge to us as teachers, because the primary tool, or a primary tool that literature teachers use, is the question. But in the world, we ask some questions, but for the most part, we make statements. This is a little bit, an interview is a little bit different context, but if you and I were talking about a book, when we had the Vygotsky seminar, you would say something, then I would say something, then Sharon would say something, and then would be follow-up questions, maybe like, oh, really?
Yeah.
Or tell me something more about that. But there will also be more statements like, well, that's not how I see it exactly. I'm thinking, and we would have a different. So I think that the way that I think I've gotten okay at thinking about the way people use texts in the world, and then creating experiences to give kids practice in miniature in doing that in their reading and writing, so that they could take on more sort of expert-like behaviors. So the question, for years, my friend Sheridan Blau and I have had a conversation about to what extent does that need to be taught. And Sheridan's argument is that they'll be able to do it on my own, and mine is, if I know that this is what is going to be rewarding for students, why oughtn't I create experiences to have them do that more quickly, more efficiently than it would if they did it on their own? Did that make sense, Anthony?
Yeah, very much. And would that mean possibly feeding them the language, feeding them the skill? Or would it be creating the experience where, like, they might organically approximate that language, and then maybe, like, delivering it from the teacher's point of view afterwards, or a combination?
It would almost always be working backwards from their activity to do some sort of naming. So let me give you a specific example that I'm interested in. So one of the things, with some dismay, I realized that I was not thinking about characterization as an important part of teaching literature, right? And I think most teachers talked about characterization in terms of, you notice these cues, these clues, and then you use these clues to make inference about a character, and it added up in some ways to our understanding of the character. But in the world, that's not how we understand people. In the world, we get a general impression of people, and then we use the individuating based in some ways on their membership in different demographic groups. So people came to this interview, they're looking at me like I'm an old man. If it's a high school teacher, you said he's a professor, well, he's an egghead, what does he know? So you get a feel for somebody, right? You get a feel for somebody, and then there's an interaction between the overall impression that you're getting and the particular details that you notice that are either confirm or disconfirm that initial impression. So that's a pretty big difference, right?
Yeah.
And so I wrote an activity for students in which I said, and who would you rather have, which of these people would you most like to have as a roommate? And then they would do a ranking activity, and in the conversation, in the ranking activity, they would say, well, I would want to have this person as a roommate because, and a couple of things would happen. They would articulate a criterion. So we also have typically a priori criteria about whether somebody is believable, admirable, whatever. So we have those things, and then we have generalizations that we make about different groups of people. So one of them is, would you want to have a person roommate? And one of the details about the person is that they're a big Star Wars fan. Well, then somebody would say, well, Star Wars, I'm not, or that they're an athlete, or that they're, a member of a different demographic group, right? So then they'd make judgments about that. But then there were also details that would say, yeah, but, and so then we would step back from this experience we just had and then sort of think about what it is, what did we do, and then we would start naming those ideas. So I would always work as a teacher. I would always try to work backwards. From what with what students did. Anthony, can we pause it for one quick second?
Sure, yeah. Those were the very best type of interruptions. It's a family call, making some dinner plans or whatever it might be. Love hearing about people and their family stories. So we might get into that, although we usually do that. I have a couple questions going through my head as for to possibly connect back to the book, but you don't have to talk about the book. So I'm wondering two things. One is, can this strategy of sort of using your gut instinct first and then revising your impression about a character based on like new information that comes in, rather than sort of building clues toward an impression, it's like impression first, but then revise it. Can that strategy work in a way as far as like dealing with information pollution or any other similar term? And then my second question is, can unreliable narrator strategies for readers, can that also transfer? So these seem to be two very good like literary reading techniques that can also apply very nicely. So do you think they can, number one? Number two, are there like Michael Smith type exercises that can be used to sort of like set it up? Or are there other exercises from the book, maybe one of which you'd want to talk about and like how it works?
Well, I think the answer to that question is, I hope the answer to that question is yes. So let's take one of the things that one of the chapters, and actually the primary author for that was Hugh Kesson, was a student of mine here at Temple.
Yeah, awesome.
He was interested. Well, Jeff and I did some work. We wrote a book called Diving Deep, which is about that. One of the things experienced readers do is that they understand that there are conventional expectations that authors have for the stuff that we're going to notice. And that experienced readers, we know that we're supposed to notice in a literary text or we're supposed to pay attention to titles, right? So in To Kill a Mockingbird, when there's a mockingbird, we know that you're supposed to pay attention to that. It's a convention that in a textbook, if something's italicized, we probably need to pay attention to that, right? So the way we distribute our attention, and this is based on an idea of Peter Rabinowitz's in Before Reading, we have those sort of a priori understandings that the kinds of things that authors do to get us to attend to things. So, and Peter calls them rules of notice, and we call them rules of notice. So we talk in Hugh's chapter, and some work he did based on Jeff's and my original work, is that we talk about 4 different kinds of rules of notice. One is ruptures. So if if we're reading text and there's lots of long paragraphs, and there's a single sentence paragraph, we know as an experienced reader, we're supposed to pay attention to that, right? We know that if there's, we know that if there are different typesets used, that's sort of rupture. We know that we're supposed to pay attention to that. Typically, certainly in literature, but whenever there's an explicit statement, whenever there's an explicit thematic statement, a direct statement of generalization, we know as experienced readers we're supposed to pay attention to that. If you see what I'm saying, we know we call a certain set of things calls to attention. If there's what we call the reader's response, if there's emotional language. So one of the things we have them do is we look at different kinds of texts and say, what are the different calls to attention? What did the creator do to draw your attention to that? And so the idea that there are things, that there are conventional understandings. So on a digital text, right, those conventional understandings might be the buttons. They might be, they might be the links, right? They might be the visuals. So we are called upon to read in different kind of way. And here's where the transfer would be complicated, because you don't use different colors in literature. Links are not a thing. Pictures tend not to be a thing. Mm-hmm. If you see banners moving, so there are lots of things that happen so we just try to raise their attention to, let me understand what the maker of this text is doing to draw my attention to certain features of this text. And then knowing that, how do I feel about those things? So that's, I think I mentioned last time we chatted, maybe not, is that I think that for literature, the idea of threshold concepts.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the threshold concept for literature is that literature is a made thing, that I have to understand that somebody made it's a function of choices that people made. Now that becomes more complicated in a digital text, because the issue of authorship is way more complicated in a digital text, because something might be posted, a blog is posted on a website. What's the relationship of authorship between the designer, the website, the person whose name's on the blog, and then even to what extent I would argue, or we argue, that the reader of a digital text is much more author-like, because you're not reading things linearly, right? I decide whether I'm going to click on the text that you would read, and with which you would engage and I would engage might be completely different. So to some extent, we're authors of our digital engagements by what we click and what we don't click. So anyway, but the big idea is, let's think about calls to attention. Let's think about direct statements. Let's think about ruptures. Let's think about, response, things designed to cultivate an emotional response. And let's look to see how those play out in different kinds of texts. And then once I've done that, then I can decide what I want to do with those things. But the big question is, what did the creators do to manipulate your attention, and how do you feel about that? Give you one example. So we're working with juniors and seniors at a comprehensive high school in Philadelphia, and they're thinking about colleges. And the school that we're at is over 90% black or brown students. And one of the students said, went to a college that he was interested in, and he looked at the picture and he said, see, look at how diverse it is. And we said, what did the creator of the website do to make you think that? And then we did a big move that we say is, let's check. So it turned out that they were 14% or something like that, people of color at this university, way more than the number that they had were put in the picture. Then we have to do something with that. So then they make a judgment about how he feels about that difference. If you see what I'm saying. So
Yeah,
that was,
I think it's interesting that the second move is the how do you feel about that question? Because it doesn't have to be that, but that seems to be sort of a strategically placed second slot question. Can you say a bit about that?
yeah. So this comes from, in some ways, the work that the theorizing that Peter Rabinowitz and I did in authorizing readers, and the you probably had this experience. Have you ever been in a situation where somebody sort of nudged you and told a joke that made you uncomfortable?
Sure.
A sexist joke, maybe something with racist over. Well, with the elections going on now, where somebody would say, "Well, that goes to show you what happened in Philadelphia," and I might understand that Philadelphia has
Yeah.
racial overtones. So, but I have to understand what the person who does the nudging wanted me to think, and then my next step has to be, how do I feel about that? Do I want to resist that? That's why authorizing readers called resistance and respect in the teaching of literature.
Interesting.
So how do I feel about being? I guess the same thing would be true. Have you ever been to a movie where you know you're being manipulated?
Yeah.
You know how you're
Yeah.
supposed, you know how you're supposed to feel, how you're meant to feel, and then you have to decide. Well,
You want to go for the ride or not? Yeah, and that could break the whole experience, and then that could impose on the especially if it's some sort of fictional world, that could really interrupt it, or you could just choose to go with it. But,
or you could choose to go with it, and then later saying, I chose to go with it, but upon reflection, that's not a place that I want to go.
yeah, no, I meant just in general, like, because there's always some sort of persuasion anytime language is being used in a story setting and others. So it doesn't necessarily mean like negative manipulation. We're always being, moved directly, suggested in some way.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think so part of the art is like developing an eye for that, maybe having your persuasion filter attuned, and yet not losing your enjoyment, or not sort of a fine line between like overanalyzing. See, for me, I intake almost all almost all public information. I apply the persuasion filter almost like unconsciously as a default, and it's just like, okay, I see what's being said here, but let's just look at it through the persuasion lens. And to what extent is that? Well, I guess you're right, because the next question is, all right, how do I feel about that?
How do I feel about that?
And I become very cynical over time, often. And, not always, but just when you could see through the persuasion, it just, well, I don't know.
Well, you could say, if we go back to the student, he could say, well, they're trying to trick me into thinking it's more diverse than it is. Or he could say, this does, and he did say, this doesn't bother me. It shows that they think that they believe in diversity. I'm okay with that. I'm okay at going with a place where they're sent such strong signals that this is a value that the institution has. So those are different ways of feeling about the same thing. But the important for us is recognizing that that was a choice that somebody made in order to, as you said, I mean, every text is designed to act on us in some kind of way. And we want to be mindful of that. And then one of the things that we work on that we try to do in the book is to think about text as part of an ongoing cultural conversation, so that it has a different sort of impact. If if one text is the only text you read, it's different than if you recognize, well, let me see what somebody else has to say about that same issue. So that's the insight Sam Weinberg and his colleagues had at Stanford, is that what fact checkers do is that they read laterally, right? And so in a digital realm, understanding how this text works and then seeing what other people say or think about the text that you're reading, the author that you're reading. I mean, you've got an infinite amount of virtually infinite amount of information at your fingertips. What are you going to do with that in order to ascertain what your position could be about this particular text?
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the possible changes happening on Twitter, for example, amongst some that don't seem very good. One of them that I like is there's something called what's it called? I forget, but what it does is it adds additional context to tweets that are either like misleading or borderline. Sometimes one person's misleading and somebody else is accurate. So it's users get to add, okay, but check out this source. Okay, but check out this source. So it's in its infancy, but like it's just giving you like a little bit more of a three-dimensional view of things, and that's not always easy to find organically. And I think emotionally, psychologically, whatever, it's not for everybody to go looking for that sort of thing. And the reason I'm so sorry, and the reason I bring that up is earlier you were saying something about like having some self-awareness and self-knowledge is one of the key strategies. Would you say that's in the realm of the threshold concept as far as like the new book goes?
I haven't thought about it in those terms, but the idea that I guess I would say yes, because the idea that I, with all my prejudices and preconceptions and susceptibilities, am implicated in this process is an important thing. They're not doing it to me. I'm doing it to me to some. I mean, they are to some extent, but I'm implicated in this. And then I think what you have to do is cultivate some sort of if someone's willing to go along for the ride without stopping, then there's nothing as a teacher we can do. What I guess all we can hope for is that for people to recognize, for our students to recognize that they are being pulled along for the ride, and then to cultivate some sort of ethical sensibilities that have them stop. Now, one of the things that I'm interested in, though, is that that I've been thinking about is you would think that the persuasion lens would be a good lens to work with. And one of the things I think we transfer as teachers, as ELA teachers, is that we think about many of the arguments that we write are interpretive arguments about literature, right? The issue that I'm starting to have with interpretive arguments about literature is that the reason teachers say give textual evidence is that textual evidence is beyond dispute. So the idea that you have to get evidence, but once you cite the evidence, then, I mean, the person said this or the writer wrote this. So the evidence itself is not in dispute. In the world, evidence is disputed. Sure. And so I think that we have to create circumstances where our students are regularly evaluating the evidence that would help them make their arguments, and not just say, well, you cite textual evidence. Just say what would be the things, we talk about it as what would create a safe starting point. So unless you're in an argument, unless if you're talking to somebody, you and I can't have a discussion unless we were willing to stipulate to some sort of shared understandings. It's impossible. So what we try to do is raise that awareness and then help them understand under what circumstance are they willing to stipulate to something? Under what circumstance does one person's story when is one person's story sufficiently dramatic, representative, truth sounding, that we're willing to count that as a safe starting point? And when aren't we? As an example.
Yeah, that's an interesting phrase, safe starting point, because it's, it's certainly not the end of the deal, but we can we could start here, right? We could deal with this
Right, because
thing, and then
once we still have to,
that's often taken for granted. Like that step is often not consciously enacted, pointed out.
or in public policy debates, I mean, as an example, the abortion debate, if people could agree when life began, there would be a different set of conversations. But there's no starting point to that
Yeah,
to that argument. I mean, there's no, once the sides are not willing to stipulate.
yeah, and there's just a lot of talking past each
So
other. And 20 years, I remember hearing you say something similar, differently, but the same topic. How difficult it is to have any productive conversation about that specific topic of abortion, just because there's no. I guess that's a nice term, safe starting point. Where agreed upon baseline or whatever. Yeah, it's just often talking past each other. I am going to just pause for 1 second. So I'm going to just share a couple things, not to ask you to read because it's too much, but there are a couple different models out there for describing fake news. This was something from Eric Weinstein. He tried to jump on it early. Sort of taxonomy on it. This is something from the Consilience Project, from a really great article called "Misleading with Facts," and they break down these different approaches for how it's done or how you might do it. And then lastly, this is way too much to read, but my point is. If you really wanted to understand facts, even individual facts, look at all that can be done. So this is really targeted for adults and a certain type of adult, I think, who's very intense and has great, something is at stake for determining the value of something. When I look at this, all these slides, I see something that's impossible for an individual to do. It can't be done. It's too much. It's overwhelming, and that's why it has to be dealt with in some individual mind.
I lost you there, Anthony.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying I don't think it could be done by an individual mind. I think some other approach has to be used, because who can actually deal with something that's filled with various facts, and oftentimes facts are used intentionally to mislead. But who could do this sort of vetting process? You can't do it on the fly. So it's too much for one mind. And that's why I think there's value in the individual developing skills, but it's not enough. So I don't have any major point or even answer or even real question. I just wanted to see what you thought of that it's too much for one person.
I sort of think that I think a little bit about the notion of orientation. So the orientation somebody takes to a task.
Mm.
So an orientation that I could take to a task is that for me to recognize that I need to do a different kind of work under certain circumstances, but I always am mindful of the fact that texts are working to act on me in particular kind of ways, right? So let's take that thing about facts. So one of the activities that we have is to have our students evaluate what we think about questions in an instrument. How good is this instrument? Now, that's just one example, but I can ask you a question to get you the answer, to get to the answer that I would want. Would you rather rejoice in the Phillies' recent success, or be a curmudgeonly old fart who thinks that if you don't win anything, you haven't done anything at all? So I've sort of framed that question as a way that, well, I'd rather rejoice. Who wants to be a
Yeah.
Right. So if we can get our students to understand that, then when it's important for them to understand, to say, well, let me look at the instrument. That's a thing that I would want them to do. They're not going to do it all the time, but to know that that's a move that they have in their repertoire when there's a context that it involves that. I need to find, so I'm going to do this lateral reading because this is really important. I know I'm susceptible here. I'm going to do this lateral reading because it's important for me to, I need to really, to really get this. I need to understand, look, this is a causal argument made from a correlation. This is an important issue to me. I need to think about that. I need to investigate that. So that's sort of what, so we're sort of trying to create these sorts of awarenesses to create an orientation of not jumping into being mindful that I'm being asked, because the algorithm, I mean, that one thing in the first slide that you gave about the algorithmic orientation, about how it's sort of the internet is meant to feed me my tribe.
Yeah.
Knowing that is an important,
Right.
that is an important thing. And then maybe in certain contexts then that I can stand against that if the occasion arises when that is something that I want to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's also a way to allow people to not be so sad, because if you just have your antenna up for that, you'll realize that so much of the the tribal algorithmic stuff is designed to bring you down, and it doesn't mean a fair amount of it isn't true. But when you realize how much you're kind of getting bombarded with information that's designed to activate you,
Right.
you don't have to be so sad or worried all the time. So that's my own take. I mean, that sort of like meta awareness that these things are going on.
So
It allows me to be a little bit less impulsive, a little less reactive, etc.
yeah. If you couple that sort of, that's what I would call an orientation. If you couple that sort of orientation to texts with some particular moves that you can make,
right?
then I think that's about as good as we can do.
Yeah, and there's something to be said for that. So
yeah, and we do it in contexts where we stand against that. So that's when we were talking last time. One of the things we were talking about creating curricular contexts in which there are multiple sustainable positions. So in those cases, then that creates an interesting arena to allow people to listen and trust, because it's not just us against them right away.
Yeah, for sure. Do any examples come to mind?
Well, I mean, one of the things what we're doing in the college access prop that I was talking to you about, I mean, one of the questions that we ask is, to what extent can we understand each other across demographic differences? I mean, that's a complicated question, and that I think that there are multiple. I mean, yes, largely we're all human. No, I can never. I mean, my daughter, who's African American, said, I'm an adopted Black woman. I know you love me, Dad, but you can't understand me. So, I mean, her position was no, you can't understand.
Yeah, I remember you saying that before. Has that position adjusted at all over time? Was that the start of the conversation or kind of the end?
It's been part of an ongoing conversation. It's becoming more fruitful as time goes on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one thing I'm hearing is, if you have a really interesting, maybe essential or existential question, sort of hovering over the work, then that sort of lateral thinking or lateral reading or position even if it's role playing, position shifting, it just happens a little more easily, I think, when it's underneath a inquiry, particularly if it's like a shared inquiry. That everybody involved is.
That's what we think.
Yeah,
that's what we think.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I wonder if there's a way to a method for dealing with information out in the world that could be confusing or polluting, so to speak. There's a way to sort of hijack your own thoughts into creating an inquiry question, like creating an essential question as almost like a, I don't know, like a personal relaxer that allows you to deal with that stuff. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, it did. So actually, one of the things that I've written about is that if there's a text that attracts you and you can slow down to understand what is it about the text that attracts you, there's probably an ongoing cultural conversation that the text, or there might be an ongoing cultural conversation in which the text is implicated. So, for example, I don't know, if you see an item where somebody's you're feeling outraged because somebody sued somebody.
Mm-hmm.
For somebody went to a McDonald's drive-up window and spilled hot coffee on themselves, and then they sued McDonald's. So if that attracts me, then I might be thinking, well, the underlying question is, to what extent am I responsible for what happens to me? Right. And so there are, that's an interesting question. I mean, well, here's an example. I just was reading the letter to the editors in the New York Times either yesterday or this morning. One of the questions was the Parkland killer, the murder, and I've forgotten his name, but should he have gotten a death penalty? And somebody wrote saying, well, I mean, it wasn't freely chosen on his part. There's fetal alcohol syndrome. So to what extent? I mean, that raised that's an ongoing question of interest to me. And it was, my younger daughter used to say whenever she lost something, she would say my coat went missing. So she would not, right? So that's an area of interest. And so so that bigger question that's underneath it, then you can say, and if you're thinking about it in sort of in conventional literary terms, then you can talk about Bigger Thomas as a turn in cultural conversation about to what extent are people responsible for what happens to them or what they do. And then you can bring in around that to what extent, I mean, there are a variety of texts that I could bring in conversation, that I could put in conversation with each other that would raise that question. Then I have to treat them in a different kind of way, because I know that they're they're speaking from the perspective of a position that's been historically sustainable. And so I think that creates sort of a different sort of atmosphere about texts. That's not atmosphere, but
no, it's not a bad word at all. I understand what you're saying. It makes sense. I'm going to, just because we have maybe 2 minutes left, and if we don't, then tell me, but would you mind taking a stab at a quick definition of the bolded terms?
Well, we talked
about maybe all of it, like just for like a soundbite definition. Possibly.
Okay, so the soundbite so the idea. So the first one in the concept of transfer is that if you learn something in one situation, that knowledge, that knowledge is not going to be inert, then you need to apply it to some other situation. And the situations that you apply it to are either going to resemble each other, which would be near transfer, or they're going to be very different from each other, which would be far transfer. What I would want people to understand is that it doesn't happen. It's harder than you think, and it doesn't happen. And that the further that you need to transfer, the more articulated an understanding you have to have about the thing that it is that you're transferring.
Yes, thank you.
The second one about text as intentional acts is that I would argue that, as I think I said, that the fundamental understanding people have to have about text is that somebody or somebody's made them, that a text is not accidental, but rather is the result of choices that people made, that a person or people made in order to foster a particular sort of response. And that once I understand that, then it helps me see, well, if a person did X, they must have wanted to have Y kind of response, because if they wouldn't have wanted Y, they would have done this other thing. So once I understand that texts are not either accidental or inevitable, then I can try to understand the moves that a maker is making in order to foster a particular kind of response. And then I can position, then as a consumer, I can understand, how do I feel about being positioned that way?
Mm-hmm. Good.
So I think we make a mistake. Text as a turn an ongoing cultural conversation. I think we make a mistake if we think about text as separate things. So as an English teacher, to say I'm doing Romeo and Juliet doesn't make sense to me, or I'm doing this text X, because texts are always part of an intertextual grid, and the intertextual grid against which we understand text, I think, is both a conceptual and a generic trajectory. So we read text as something, and we read text to be about something, recognizing both of those things, that there are other texts that relate to it in some kind of way. So we make a mistake if we read text independent of the sort of conceptual and generic trajectory in which they are arrayed. I don't know.
Generic meaning the genre.
The genre
generic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Yes.
And threshold concepts, the way I understand them, which is just those concepts that are necessary for you to learn other concepts, and that once you get them, it changes your attitude towards it. Irrevocably changes your understanding of the domain in which you're operating. So that's literature. So how many times you've had kids say, do you think that she really meant this, that the author really meant to do this? And the answer to that is yeah. Now, that the author might not have conscious control, but might have. But texts are made things, that they're a function, I think that's a key understanding in textual studies. Once we recognize that texts are made things, then we can understand the sign systems or the signs that are being used and the ends to which they're being used. So that's what I got.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Under the gun. This was very, very fruitful, and the only problem is that I'm aging and you're aging backwards, so it's a bit of a problem. Next time I see you, I'm going to dye my hair. Okay.
All right. Thanks, man. I got to go get the gab.
Yeah, you got it. Say hello, please. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it, Anthony. Thanks.
I'm glad to hear it. Same.
It's flattering to be asked.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Okay. All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.